Hey folks, welcome to the Manga Dungeon, where I do a deep dive on a manga series that seemed interesting, and absolutely is not a cover for tax evasion or any other violent crimes. This is more like me getting on a train and babbling aloud to whoever's listening, except for it's just manga and stuff, instead of how the CIA bugged my orange juice or something. So anyway, the red, blue, and green arc of Pokemon Adventure, or Pokemon Special if you're a weeb, and let's be real here. Most Pokemon media is pretty hard to judge on its own merits, and I'm not even going to try to do that thing where you watch a video about, let's say, Mario 64, and they start a poorly researched bit about how Shigeru Miyahan was hunting bugs and flipping over turtles as a child in this Japanese backwater town. I don't need to explain what Pokemon is or its cultural impact. Mostly because if you're north of 30, you're just old enough to know that for a whole generation of people, Pikachu and company were just as influential to them as Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse were on generations prior. And if you're younger than that, then you're most likely young enough to not only understand that, but feel it on a fundamental and gut level, or at the very least see its impact firsthand, or at least in first world countries anyway. But I will give some context to go in with that will probably shed some light on my personal interpretation of the media. The Pokemon anime, that's probably the most popular part of Pokemon as a property, has a lot more in common with Detective Conan or Doraemon than One Piece. While all three of these are infinitely running series, One Piece has a specific goal in mind. For Luffy, that's to be king of the pirates, with constant updates in lore, stakes that are consistently rising, and numerous plot threads that are given just enough tangibility to where you want the series to eventually end and have that expectation for it, and in many cases make not entirely baseless speculation on how much steam Luffy's voyage has left, but also has just enough loose ends, legends, and lore to go off of to where the series can go on basically for as long as it needs to before hitting the finish line. Pokemon has more in common with Detective Conan as a series, as something with a premise that implies an ongoing plot, but is mostly a pretense for a more day-to-day series. For Conan, that's using the plot of a drug that turned him into a child and solving the mystery of who did it and why and finding a permanent solution to the problem of him being a child again as a method to get to the boy genius solving problems, meat of the actual show. And for Pokemon, that's Ash going out and catching all the Pokemon and becoming a Pokemon Master and doing all that video game stuff as mostly a pretense for Ash goofing off in the countryside and hanging out with Pokemon. I speculate this is largely a byproduct of Takeshi Shudo, who worked on Minky Momo, and a ton of other old anime from basically another era, with either glacial pacing or no pacing whatsoever, with a pretty much constant status quo. That factor combined with the actual Pokemon games resetting their continuity every couple of years, with at best some mild references to previous games, and Nintendo's overall love of soft rebooting itself and pretending like whatever the previous game was didn't happen or has limited relevance to what's happening right now, has led to the adventure manga generally being seen as one of the more favored versions of Pokemon, mostly by virtue of nothing else in the series or Nintendo's back catalog at all really likes to acknowledge in any meaningful way that there's a proud legacy for it to stand on. Every arc may be its own standalone journey, but each of those journeys is built upon the shoulders of what came previously. For example, again much like JoJo, we have characters that do age in between arcs that also pop in and out of the spotlight, depending on usually if they showed up in the previous games, or if the game that the manga is adapting has any relationship with one of those. The manga also has one of my favorite versions of filler that we'll get to in another video, but for the time being, let's say that whenever it's time for the manga to adapt either a third version of a game or a remake of a game, instead of retreading the same old material, they'll use this as a chance to catch up with what characters are doing that we haven't seen in a while, or alternatively tell their own story with some of the material that was retroactively added into the game. For example, with Leaf Green and Fire Red, we see what Red's doing later on, along with Deoxys and all that good stuff. And in the Yellow arc, we also see what all these characters have been doing after all the stuff that's going to happen in this video happens. Generally, the manga sort of follows the plots of the games, but the characters have agency and stakes that take huge overall fun liberties with the concepts and ideas that flow a lot closer to other shonen series that have an ongoing plot and specific arcs and resolutions and goals than an infinitely running comedy would have. That's a lot of preamble, especially because we're mostly going to be talking about just part 1 today, with the rest of it coming some other time, because I generally feel that the adventure manga for every arc has enough meat to basically stand on its own, and I rarely see anything beyond part 1 being discussed. So for the time being, ignore all that blood by your feet and let's hop into part 1 with the plot. Red is a trainer with a Poliwhirl who thinks he's generally pretty good at it, and even wants to challenge Professor Oak one day, mostly on merit of him sounding like he's pretty good at Pokemon. Red then hears some goons announcing their evil plans to catch a phantom Pokemon in the forest, and Red says, yeah, I think I'll get in on that, but maybe a little less evil. Going into Viridian Forest, he encounters a trainer named Blue, who is also known as Green in some versions because of reasons, battling the legendary Pokemon Mew. Blue knows immediately that his fresh-caught Pokemon isn't going to stand a chance against this thing, but Red jumps in and says, this is stupid, let's just catch it and get it over with, and gets his ass promptly handed to him. Blue berates Red for not knowing an enemy is stronger than him just at a glance. I appreciate this early on that they're treating Pokemon in theory much like a trading card game. At this point, trading card games, link cables, and tradable monsters are kind of a new thing, so the best way to handle this is basing characters and archetypes and relationships kind of like what you would find in a card game community like Magic, or at the time recent relative to the manga's release, Pokemon cards, where a newish player may be the best in their local playgroup, making theoretically sound plays and strategies and decks, etc., but not having the experience of just knowing what the meta is, and being the best of a bunch of rookies doesn't really mean a whole lot if you don't really have a sense of what strategy is based on an opening move. Red's never really been beaten with this type of ease before, and he naturally learned something that most people have to be told about card games. You're only going to get better by playing against people better than you. Later, Red visits Professor Oak, who has an old, decrepit office, and makes friends with a Bulbasaur, and spooks the professor because you can't just walk into people's houses. What is this, a video game? Jeez. Well, I mean, you can, but just don't leave any witnesses. Red ends up letting all the Pokemon go, but the combined efforts of him, Bulbasaur, and the professor spending all day hunting them down leads into the last one, which is an aggressive Machoke. Red hasn't really done a whole lot of battling up until this point. He's just sort of aware of what Bulbasaur is capable of. The professor is so impressed by Red's natural empathy to Pokemon and prowess in catching and battling, and being an all-around good guy, he lets Red keep the Bulbasaur, and gives him a Pokedex with a task of catching all the Pokemon. Red, as turns out, isn't really super interested in this. He does take it as a chance to go on an adventure. This is the part where someone with a small baby brain would joke about Professor Oak sending children out into the wild to ditch school to hang out with dangerous animals and such, to say that Professor Oak has relatively little regard for the safety of children. In the manga, this is basically true. Professor Oak is a pretty forgetful guy who really makes unwise decisions when it comes to the safety of the people around him. As we'll see a little later, while Mother's Basement made a very good video about Pokemon and world building, the series makes it very clear that having someone like Professor Oak in your local area for the Pokemon world is a sign of cultural and economic privilege. So I'm guessing the implication here is when Professor Oak asks you to do something, you probably don't want to say no because you're really not going to have many opportunities like this, because the Pokedex ends up being something that's basically invaluable and pretty much a mark of every protagonist from here on, much like Morphers and Power Rangers or Super Sentai or the Joestar birthmark in JoJo. While not initially super critical, the Pokedex ends up granting a lot of very critical things that any trainer would need in the wild, and they aren't exactly easy to come by. The same goes for just being given a Pokemon, and as we'll see later, being a trainer is actually a very dangerous profession. If Bulbasaur hadn't have been there, that Machoke would have just snapped Red's neck. And I'm not saying that as an edgy joke here, because depending on the circumstances, Pokemon are treated almost like JoJo or Escryed abilities, with very specific powers or utilities that put the protagonist into all sorts of trouble, as opposed to the friendly, marketable animals defined mostly by ones, zeros, and stats. I mean, they are marketed like that sometimes as friendly animals, but do you really want to know how Victreebel eats? Because we do find that out. So Red takes off to Viridian Forest where he meets Blue again, and they begin fighting over a Kangaskhan. The tables have been turned with Blue being the one who's quite a bit ignorant, as the Pokemon doesn't really want to be caught and he doesn't understand why. Blue just thinks it's being an asshole, but Red immediately knows that Pokemon usually don't want to be caught for a specific reason. And this is because its young was injured. This is the start of Red and Blue's character arc throughout the manga, with Red being pretty good at Pokemon training and such, and by all means he's already proven himself with a certain amount of competence, but this just isn't at a professional grade. He's thinking competently, sure, but he isn't thinking smart. Red is good, but he doesn't always think. Blue, as his rival, tends to be his mirror. It's rumored that he was outright trained by Professor Oak, and given this version of the professor being a little cold at times and showing outright disregard for the sake of his work, it wouldn't be too wild if Blue also had this habit, minus the years of experience to dial it back. He's good at battling like we saw in the first chapter, and gauging how strong an enemy is at a glance and knowing when to back down, and while he is technically skilled, he isn't especially sensitive and not really able to have teamwork happen very well, putting his work ahead of the results and actually caring about his Pokemon. In terms of Yu-Gi-Oh!, he would be the guy that needs to learn about the heart of the cards and just net decks all day or something like that. Red and Blue are more friendly rivals than most other forms of their rivalry go, mostly because they both immediately understand that they have something to learn from each other. Learning to see what a Pokemon is thinking and how it's feeling and being empathetic is immediately useful as a soft skill that Blue just doesn't have. And Red already wants to be a good trainer, but having Blue's level of discipline would be something that's immediately impactful and is touched on much later on in one of my favorite chapters, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The manga from here is mostly Red having 1 and 2 chapter vignettes, doing stuff that was in the Pokemon game, but maybe with a little bit more real-life context for what all this video game stuff is. One of my favorite of these vignettes is Red moving on to Pewter City, where he sees a Pikachu causing trouble, stealing food, and shocking all the inhabitants of being a general nuisance to society, and no one around is a good enough trainer to deal with this thing. So Red smoothly swoops in and catches Pikachu. But Pikachu doesn't want to be here, it doesn't want to be on Red's team, it doesn't want to fight, it's mostly interested in continuing on doing what it does. Later on, Blue tells Red about gym leaders and how it works, and to show up at Pewter Gym tomorrow for a match against the gym leader Brock. Red says no problem and hits the Pokemon Center, which is out of order, leaving him with Pika that really does not want to be here, Poliwhirl and Bulbasaur that are both a little beat up at the moment. Red ends up having a type advantage over most Pokemon trainers that comes his way, so he does pretty much the same thing you would probably do in the video game at this point, and just hit them before they hit you and hope you don't get hit back. This only takes him so far to where he is forced in sending out Pikachu, which again really does not want to be here, and it's just acting up. The gym leader Brock thinks that Red is just goofing around and doesn't know how to train his Pokemon, and goes full force, almost crushing poor Pikachu. Pikachu wasn't in any real danger, but Red thinks it is, so he hops in, gets Pikachu out of there, and explains one of the most emotionally frank things I've seen in Pokemon, and these sort of frank discussions are something I always have a soft spot for in media. Red pulls Pikachu over and says, "Hey, listen, I understand you don't want to be here. You don't owe me anything. You don't have to fight on my behalf. I'm sorry for putting you out there. But hey, I would really like to be your friend, and I think we can work something out even if you don't have to fight." Pikachu is actually perfectly capable of fighting very well because it's just sort of like that and very scrappy, and says, you know, this guy seems alright, he's probably not as shitty as I thought he was, and just shocks the inside of Onyx's mouth, I think. This isn't supposed to work, but okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Letting Red claim the Boulder Badge. It's not the inherent implication that this is a new Pokemon that's joined the team so everything will be okay that gets Red through this, because Red's caught other Pokemon before, but he only has 3 of them on his person, and one of them was caught only a day prior. It's because he's just such an empathetic person, and someone that isn't above trying to understand what someone is going through, that makes Red such a likable protagonist. But anyway, back to this whole Onyx thing. I guess the logic here is that you can shock the inside of it, but not the outside. And I guess that's fine. Sometimes the logic is a little bit shaky on how Pokemon attack and powers work. And you just need to accept the logic that sometimes it just sort of works. or really stretch the game logic. Or, on the other hand, keep in mind this is an early adaptation of Pokemon where they probably didn't have much more than a few production notes to work off of. I suspect that the anime ended up writing the book on how to adapt Pokemon media should roughly go, but given the release dates of the anime being in April of 97 and the manga in August of 97, I suspect pre-production for the manga started not too long after the anime was released. Short enough to where the manga was more than comfortable doing its own thing, but long enough to know that Pikachu having an attitude problem is iconic. Red ends up being harassed by a Gyarados that belonged to Misty. Initially, this was her Magikarp that had been, at some point, abducted by Team Rocket and forced to evolve, and also became much more angry in the process. This and other plot points that we see being used in the first 2 arcs of Pokemon Adventure end up being a huge part of the plot for Pokemon Gold and Silver, or the actual games. I wonder if they had any pre-production notes for what they wanted Team Rocket to do that were eventually turned into reality for Pokemon Gold and Silver, or is Pokemon at this point, by its nature, the kind of property where there's only a finite number of places where you can go for a rising villain threat. Specifically, the idea of kidnapping Pokemon, making them evolve, and making them fight without going through the process of normally capturing them and having them getting stronger and evolving as a byproduct of cruelty and greed and not caring for others, as opposed to being a byproduct of working together, teamwork, and developing yourself internally and externally, along with helping your friends do the same. Sort of like in Dragon Ball Z, where it's very easy to make a bad guy artificially strong by just being naturally buff, or just being straight up artificial, because the correct way to get strong, or at least as far as the narrative tells us, is to put blood, sweat, and tears into that. And being artificially strong is a natural way of having the evil version of that, or at least that's how the narrative normally plants it. So Red and Misty decide to team up to take down Team Rocket because Red, being someone that is naturally very empathetic to Pokemon, would find this sort of thing absolutely aberrant. The duo has a scuffle with Team Rocket in Mount Moon, where we find out that some gym leaders can be evil, or at least you would know that if you played the game and you had seen Koga being evil. And Team Rocket's plan seems to surround itself with getting very beefed up Pokemon that are somehow artificially made to be stronger. The two have a thankfully off-screen training arc, where they get a lot stronger, and Red ends up claiming the Cascade Badge, not because he defeated Misty, but because he's gotten so much stronger on the way. Then Red heads north because reasons, and this happens? Yeah, don't worry, it's fine, it's just Double Team. In every adaptation of Pokemon, this whole thing where Bill turns himself into a Pokemon thing just seems normal, and I'll come back to the implication of this in a little bit, but it happened, and it's weird. Anyway, down in Vermilion City, Red meets the Pokemon fan club chairman, who's talking about a bunch of Pokemon that are being kidnapped, and Red, in a moment of being a little smarter than he usually is, notices that if you're going to be kidnapping Pokemon, and the implication is that kidnapped Pokemon can't go into their balls, you need a large space to store them, and the best way to do that is on a ship. And hey, there just so happened to be a very suspicious ship nearby. Red sneaks onto the ship and finds out about the plan being to sell the stolen Pokemon, and is caught by Lieutenant Surge, who is still a gym leader here, but another member of Team Rocket. Poliwhirl is soundly defeated by his angry, chained-up Electabuzz, and Red is shocked and tossed overboard to drown. Again, this is another case of the anime has rules that they specifically say aloud, where you know that Pokemon battles have regulations, and the video game is a video game, so it has rules baked into its text. The manga didn't really have that, where it just sort of is understood that the best way to stop someone from sending Pokemon at you is just straight up murder. This actually comes up a few times in the earlier part of the manga. Right now I've only read a few parts in, but I think this is a thing just going forward, where the best way to win a Pokemon battle is to just kill the other guy, and the Pokemon are mostly just a pretext in how to do that. So Poly turns from a Poliwhirl into a Poliwrath, Something very similar happened when Red was young, where his Poliwag turned into a Poliwhirl to come to his rescue, and we're seeing that being mirrored here, because Red and Poliwhirl have been together for a very long time, and it's very sweet. Now, normally Poliwhirls evolve by the Water Stone, but here it just sort of does it, because anime, I guess. But eventually they do get around to explaining this and retconning that reason in, and that's why I love this manga. It's very good about going back and retconning in some of the weird stuff, especially for the earlier sections where things are especially weird and very off-brand for Pokemon. If it feels like I'm speeding through a lot of this, that's because most of this is made up of vignettes, where Red does stuff that happened in the game, but made more real with some of the emotional weight that's attached to it, or some of the real-life implications that come with it that don't always have a huge payoff. The implication here is that we're checking up to see where Red is after about a week or so with each chapter, unless otherwise stated, because it's in itself a weekly series. Speaking of stuff just happening, Red joins a bike race, gets mauled by Beedrill, used their honey to wake up a Snorlax that he captures, goes to Lavender Town to look for Blue, who's gone missing, and this happens, sees some spooky ghosts and some uncharacteristically zombie Pokemon. Not Pokemon that, are like based on a zombie, but Pokemon that are rotting and falling apart and are actual zombies that are being controlled by a mysterious fog that turns out to be ghastly. Something that comes up a lot during the manga, especially during the earlier arcs, is that in the games and most other forms of media, entire lines of Pokemon are functionally treated as one Pokemon. A Charmeleon is basically a weaker Charizard, a Dratini is just a weaker Dragonite with no legs. Given that Ghost and the Supernatural end up coming up in the manga from time to time, especially in the first part, there's only one line of Ghost Pokemon, that's Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. And it's cool that they've had to figure out ways to make that work. In this case, treating Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar as three distinct assets to work with their own physiology. Like Ghastly being a literal cloud of mysterious gas with supernatural properties with a core in the center, and Gengar being a thing with actual arms and legs and able to walk around, so it's fine if they have slightly different powers and behaviors. Red dispatches all the ghosts and zombie Pokemon, with the culprit behind this again being Team Rocket, specifically the gym leader Koga that Red and Misty bumped into at Mount Moon. Team Rocket had been using the tower and its natural scariness to keep people away as sort of a natural hideout. And then this happens, and that one that everyone talks about to say the manga is darker or edgier, but don't worry, that Arbok is fine. I guess they can just kind of grow back, but we don't find that out until much later. Blue and Koga from here on end up having a bit of an edgy guy to edgy guy rivalry. And after all this has been resolved, Team Rocket has been routed and the two set off on their own separate ways. Later, Red checks in on Professor Oak and gives him a call. The professor tells him about a third Pokemon that he had that wasn't taken by Red or Blue, that turns out to be another trainer that Red meets along the way named Green. Green is a safe-for-work Fujiko Mine. She is a trickster and a thief-like character who ends up conning Red out of 2 of his badges and a whole lot of money too. But on average, it's fair to say she's one of the good guys, but typically when she's involved, it's safe to assume that she's serving her own purposes that just so happens to align with Red and company. Green is a character that didn't appear in the games, but was slated to. Initially, she was going to be the girl protagonist character, but presumably that was scrapped for time. However, artwork of her still does remain, and I definitely appreciate the idea of using characters that were initially cut content to fill in some gaps with your protagonist. On a related note, I'm happy that Pokemon got off on the right foot trying to nail representation early. I'm certainly not an expert to talk about complicated sociological issues that are unique to Japan, but at the most surface possible examination, shonen series have this issue where the coolest person is generally determined by how well they can punch a guy and in turn punched back. But the whole idea of don't hit women also applies in Japan too. So you have this issue where a lot of writers don't want to draw women out there throwing down like the boys do because they feel that it's not entirely proper to show women getting hit. which I guess is a double-edged sword because the intentions here are good because you don't want to enable violence against women, but that has the broader effect of women don't really have very big roles in most shonen series, and that's, again, mostly because shonen as a genre, or at least the ones that involve fighting, the coolest person is determined by who does the most fighting. And if women aren't doing a whole lot of fighting, then you're not going to see a whole lot of cool women. Now, of course, there certainly are exceptions to these rules, and one method that shonen action series have used to get around this is by having women be the ones that fight indirectly, like being archers and mages and thieves and things like that, and Pokemon is no exception to this, but Pokemon is unique in a property, or at the very least unique in its broader fighting genre, because characters never really fight directly. There aren't really too many fist-to-fist confrontations in Pokemon. Everything is fought by proxy with your Pokemon. So you pretty much get a free pass on including pretty much any type of character that you want to, because you don't have to show them doing that much stuff. So it's not exactly a whole lot of extra work to include, say, a disabled character, because people with disabilities don't exactly do a whole lot of fighting, because people with disabilities aren't exactly expected to be the world's greatest fighters. But if it's a person that is calling the shots for some other entity that's fighting, then you suddenly given them a whole lot of ability to fight back. And I'm happy that, again, Pokemon jumped on this early because a lot of its proxy battling peers really fell behind on that, hinting at deeper-seated sociological issues at play here. While this tendency seemed to really shine much later in the Pokemon's lifespan as an international property, from the get-go, this actually seems very clear, since even from Generation 1, about half of all named characters in Pokemon are women. Because Pokemon is fully aware that it takes place in a fantasy world, and the rule of cool is based around Pokemon battling with everything else being secondary or even tertiary information, Pokemon from the get-go got away with casting whatever gender, sexuality, or skin color that they really wanted for a character, while that representation didn't really come into its own until around 2006, where Pokemon began bringing everything in-house and making sure that everything that came out of it went through a certain method of approval. Those seeds of being inclusive were there from day one. Anyway, back to Red. He's managed to sneak into a Team Rocket hideout in Celadon, and finds out that they're trying to create a Mewtwo Pokemon from clone Mew cells, and they either need more Mew cells or that disc back that Green at an earlier point stole from them. While Green did steal a lot from Red earlier on, including both of his gym badges, Red realizes that anyone who has the courage to say, "fuck Team Rocket," couldn't possibly be that bad of a person. Speaking of, here's Green right now with the disc. And Green is, like I said earlier, very great. The first thing she does is toss the disc into her Wartortle's mouth and says, "If you hurt me, that disc is getting smashed." And by the way, she's just wearing Red's two badges like it's fine and she didn't steal them. The two battle Team Rocket and end up getting away, with Green flying away on her inflated Jigglypuff, and that's great. Pretty much everything Green does, from what she's doing in the story to what Pokemon she has, generally serves a very specific purpose. We'll get back to this a little bit later when we talk more about the characters in depth, but just know that about her character, that every single step she takes is all in service of a greater plan. Checking in on Blue, he's just one big at the Celadon game corner, and cashed in his chips for a Porygon that, much like Pika, isn't super interested in being friends. And through some mishaps, Red and Blue end up swapping Pokemon teams, and they have to basically put up with each other's opposite styles for a while. Blue's Pokemon don't really understand Red's more casual, laid-back nature and attitudes to everything. They mostly respond to unambiguous battle commands and like to bite and all sorts of other feral stuff that you have to apply a lot of pressure and get very strict to get them to listen. Over the next few days, they get more and more used to Red's more laid-back style of battling and training, where his Pokemon, he sees them more as his friends than his party members. This chapter actually ends up giving a little bit more narrative context to Pokemon that only evolve by trading. Blue's Machoke ends up turning into Machamp by learning to fight with a little bit more heart and learning a different perspective. That's a very interesting way to handle this fairly cynical method Nintendo put in of having you buy 2 games so you can get all the Pokemon by trading them, because some of them only evolve when you trade them, by adding the context that Pokemon that evolve by trading isn't a side effect of Nintendo wanting you to buy a Game Link and another Pokemon game and possibly 2 Game Boys, but as a side effect of Pokemon seeing the world, fighting and learning to live with other people, and seeing horizons that they would have never saw otherwise, as a reason for internal growth, and as a result, in external growth of evolution. Red gets his Pokemon back after they've learned a couple of new tricks from Blue, and vice versa. Then Red visits the Celadon Gym, where the gym leader Erica has tasked him to, instead of battling, as a pretense for that, to go out and find a specific unusual Pokemon. That is an Eevee that has been experimented by Team Rocket, where it's using attacks where it normally wouldn't be able to do, and switching around elements, which is something that is more characteristic of when it evolves. Red shows that he's actually not totally evil, passing Erica's secret test of character, and she lets him keep the Eevee and also claim the Rainbow Badge as well. With Sabrina, another one of Team Rocket's evil gym leaders, watching on high, twirling her mustache, or at least her Kadabra's mustache. Red then hits the Safari Zone. It's not too eventful despite being a 2-parter, but just know that Pokemon absolutely will eat you alive and don't care, and seem to have their own culture, mating rituals, and habits that are sometimes heavily disrupted by trainers. Here we have 2 Nidokings that are trying to mate with a Nidoqueen. Red catches the Nidoqueen, and then the 2 Nidoking relentlessly pursue him across the Safari Zone, where Red almost gets murdered by them, and also eaten alive by Victory Bell. So that's fun. Also, real animals exist, so this is still early enough in Pokemon's history where actual animals are at least thought about. He also visits the Diglett Cave to look for fossils. He and an older man decide to visit the Diglett Cave to look for fossils, but then find Magmar starting fires in Peter City that Red puts out with some quick thinking and non-violent means. It turns out the older man was Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, who had actually heard back from Sabrina and had been scouting Red out to see if Red was going to be an issue going forward, which seeing his prowess as a trainer, this is going to be an issue. Red is generally happy to solve things in a relatively non-violent means, but these Magmar that are starting a fire apparently will always come after anyone because Magmar are notoriously vengeful apparently. So Giovanni does the opposite of what Red would have done and just murders the Magmar outright with his cloister, as soon as Red turns his back and they decide to part ways. Red continues on his way south to get HM3, and boy, I meant to go into this judging the manga on its own merits, or at least somewhat, but this is actually way more demanding of Pokemon knowledge than I thought it was. Oh well. So HM3 contains the ability Surf, which lets Red's Pokemon transport him across water, or swim long distances. I guess Poliwhirl can't do that for some reason. You can say it may be a size thing, but Blue's Golduck, that's much smaller, he generally rides like a jet. And this is also, on a related note, the only time Golduck has ever looked cool. Red ends up crushing HM3 in a battle with a Dragonite, but Misty drops by just in time to trade Red a random Pokemon he caught for her Gyarados that's actually calmed down quite a bit since the last time we've seen it. Red travels towards the Seafoam Islands, and along the way, Team Rocket is working on a Plan B, with Mewtwo escaping. So the plan now is to get Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno and do something with them. Along the way, Red meets Blaine, the Cinnabar gym leader, an ex-Team Rocket member who thought this way of life was just all too gruesome, and he has to find Mewtwo. Ultimately, it's because Mewtwo has some of Blaine's cells, and that somehow makes Blaine able to detect when Mewtwo is nearby, and when one of them, Blaine or Mewtwo, feels pain, the other one will as well. I appreciate them taking so many huge liberties with Pokemon here, and honestly, I wish more adaptations handled its material like this. As unpopular of a comparison it is to make, the closest I've seen is a Zelda TV show. As bad as it is, and boy is it bad, they do typically tie the weird video game stuff into something that's closer to mass media. For Zelda, that was tying in romantic comedy and generally pretty bad Filmation shows. And for Pokemon, that is tying it into long-running shonen drama. Generally speaking, characters that are geographically close to something in-game also have some relevancy in the manga as well. For example, there's a lot of business that took place at the Burn Laboratory on Cinnabar Island. The only way to progress in the game is to venture into the Burn Laboratory to find the key to the Cinnabar Island gem. Inside of the lab, the player will be confronted with all the atrocities that must have went down there in the creation of Mewtwo. It can be reasonably assumed that Blaine purposely put the key here, so by proxy he must have some type of relationship with Mewtwo, but the game is generally happy to let you quietly speculate as to exactly what that nature was. While a lot of flavor text does point to him in fact being a scientist, this is never stated inside of the game's text. Generally speaking, Pokemon games, when it comes to the darker elements of its lore, or at least for the first couple of games, like to put things in the background and let you quietly speculate its connections. This is another reason why the manga is seen as so much more spicier and a fresher breath air than its anime and game counterparts, because Nintendo as a whole generally enjoys it if a property doesn't really put its more grim side forward. Pokemon is generally on the lighter end of this, mostly by virtue of its settings being relatively contemporary, and the relationships between people, Pokemon, and the technology around them are somewhat mimicked by our relationship with people, technology, and our own history. This may be a more America-centric take on this, but I get the feeling that Pokemon likes to set all of its bad stuff in a sort of recent history, is that it feels tangible enough to be a thing that you understand happen and you can see the mechanisms of happening and even see the repercussions of to this day, but because the implication is that it happened before your lifespan, or at the very least before you had a full understanding of the world around you, it somehow feels a little bit less nebulous. Like I, as a 90s child, something from the 80s, not necessarily a atrocity, but say Ninja Turtles, feels somehow less fuzzy and less tangible because it wasn't something I lived through. So the atrocities that happened in Cinnabar Lab, I would imagine, since Red would have been probably 5 or younger when all this was happening, somehow feels a little less tangible. Okay, this video is getting literally over 3 times longer than I thought it was going to be already, so let's get back to Pokemon. So Team Rocket is still around, and Eevee and Gyarados have previously been experimented on by Team Rocket and have a hard time keeping their cool. Some cool Blaine stuff happens, and Red can't really deal with flying Pokemon well. So thanks to Blaine and some cool fossil revival tech, he is saved from Moltres by an Aerodactyl that's been brought back to life. Red heads back to Pallet Town to pay Professor Oak a visit, where it turns out he's been kidnapped and replaced with Sabrina's Kadabra. Professor Oak was kidnapped to replace Blaine, and Sabrina invites him to the Silphco base in Saffron, where Professor Oak is being held hostage. It turns out Team Rocket was using Sabrina's Pokemon to cast an illusion over Pallet Town, and Professor Oak's lab is actually just in ruins. This reminds me of that part in Final Fantasy VII that at the time I guess would have been kind of recent, so maybe there's some connection there. I really like this manga because they aren't afraid to bump up the scope of how bad things actually are, because Pokemon games typically don't really punish you for backtracking much, and are so focused on being a mostly living, breathing world, and the context of the journey being mostly a road trip, it's hard to communicate agency and scale. Maybe I'm so entrenched in the way Pokemon usually does its storytelling that I have a hard time seeing some of the scenarios here as being kind of generic if they are, but for me, there's an extra amount of charm because that's not the type of storytelling Pokemon normally does. Speaking of video game stuff adapted in creative ways, Red hits Saffron City, but the guards in all 4 directions are refusing entry, so he just flies on in. I would make a joke here about take a shot whenever a video game thing happens, especially when they can narratively make it work in a relevant and creative way, but I wonder if the subtext here, in the game anyway, is the guards not letting you through without a drink in the game is because they were being paid off by Team Rocket to not let anyone in. However, they weren't being paid off well enough to just ignore someone bringing them by lunch. Okay, again, let's get back to Pokemon. Red realizes that if the Professor Oak in Pallet Town was a fake, for at least some amount of time, all the Pokemon he's been sending back there may be in trouble, including his Eevee that was previously being experimented on by Team Rocket, and also hunted as well. They wanted Professor Oak presumably for a reason relating to Mew. In fact, it seems relatively arbitrary that a seasoned Pokemon trainer and seasoned doctor like Professor Oak would move into a podunk nowhere like Pallet Town, especially when having a high-esteemed professor, and by proxy that type of wealth of knowledge and resources like Professor Oak's in the Pokedex, in the area would usually be a mark of economic privilege. That sounds like a huge thing I just said, and spoilers, we're not really going to get into it that much today, but it is a factor for Green's motivation as a trainer. In any case, Red says forget about the guards and just tries to get into the city itself, but it's being walled off by a psychic barrier. Red, Blue, and Green meet up and brought here by the same reason, to bring down Team Rocket. And they pretty much turn to the camera to say this is where the final showdown is going to be, and make the first steps into getting into the city. Blue uses his gold duck to psychically scan the city and send that to his Pokedex because I guess it can do that. And Red has Pika use Substitute to bypass the barrier while having the information gold duck is scanned transferred over to Pika because I guess it can do that. And they find Sabrina's Mr. Mime that's been making the barrier around the city, take it out, and make their way towards Team Rocket's base. Hey guys, postscript that I'm adding in after the video's been recorded. This would have been a good time to mention that Silphco probably should have been spelled Sylph as in fairy, and Co is probably company, but I guess I was 28 years old when I realized that. Also a good time to mention that a lot of the technology you see in Pokemon up till this point is a byproduct of Silphco. We're going to talk about technology and stuff way later on in the video, but it seemed like a good point to at least bring up the idea that if there's going to be someone in the Pokemon world that is abusing technology, it should be Team Rocket, and if there's going to be someone that's being taken advantage of, it would be the Silph Company. Okay, back to my regularly scheduled rambling. As soon as the trio enter the building, they are then separated. Blue gets ambushed by Koga, Red has a rematch with Lieutenant Surge, and Green fights Sabrina. I'm skipping a lot here because this is just a plot section. I'll come back to the characters a little bit later. But for the time being, just know that this is a big emotional scene for all 6 of these characters. But I'll touch down on the characters later, but just know for now. But Red is outright disgusted with Surge. Surge isn't just trying to beat Red in a Pokemon match, but he's trying to outright murder him with his Magneton. And also a bazooka that shoots electrodes, and that's cool. He's also disgusted with the idea that Surge became a gym leader. And Red believes that gym leaders have a social responsibility to be the best, most heroic trainers that they can be. The gym leaders, for the most part, seem openly evil, but I'm guessing the implication here is that anyone who's gotten far enough to see a high-ranking Team Rocket member's face should have already been dead, and Red and company are just that good at Pokemon training that they're the exception to the rules, slipping by and able to fight Team Rocket head-on. Anyway, Red is getting shocked a lot, and Surge should have run out of juice at this point, but it turns out he's using Zapdos to give him even more juice than he should have been able to shock Red to death. Red uses Ivysaur's Razor Leaf to cut the chains that have been holding back Zapdos, and some clever shonen trickery to put Lieutenant Surge in the position to get shocked instead of Red, claiming the Thunder Badge, as well as Lieutenant Surge's insulated gloves that will become a staple for Red's outfit throughout the rest of the series, and even have a little bit of plot relevancy later on. Meanwhile, Blue almost straight up dies to Koga's Grimer. The battle here is more of a means to an end than the end itself. The Koga that Blue saw was actually just a Grimer that ended up catching Blue off guard. Koga uses his gold bat to project this over to Professor Oak, thinking if Professor Oak can't just be reasoned or intimidated, maybe a little bit of blackmail and watching his grandson in pain will do the trick. Then Red shows up to even out the odds, but Koga has Articuno, leaving the two frozen solid. Koga seems to have a little bit of honor and respect for the two, saying that he wished they could have just joined Team Rocket instead and had been his underlings. But we'll talk about Koga's honor some other time when we hit the Pokemon Yellow arc, where we see a lot more of this. Anyway, the semi-regretful morning doesn't last too long because Blue anticipated Koga having Articuno. He had already sent his Charizard outside that had been slowly lighting the building on fire, unthawing the two, giving them a chance to take down Koga. Green's fight with Sabrina isn't quite as interesting in execution, but in context, it is fun seeing two tricksters fight one another. Sabrina uses her Alakazam's hypnosis to stop Green in her tracks, and then uses Slash to grip Green's dress, revealing that she had 2 Pokeballs in her bra. Okay, we're gonna pause here again for a moment. This is one of the few points where the Viz translation of Pokemon Adventure comes under fire. There are 4 major changes to my understanding. One was changing Pokemon nicknames, where in the first arc, They just removed all the nicknames where they before had a sort of naming scheme to them where it would be a pun on the Pokemon's name and something else that sounds like a name after it, depending on the trainer. Like Red would just call his Pokemon whatever the first part of their name was, like calling Poliwhirl Polly or calling Pikachu Pika, etc. 2 is changing every chapter name from versus whatever the featured Pokemon is to being some type of Pokemon-related pun, like the chapter versus Ninetales that featured Blue fighting Ninetales is now called Ninetales Tale, or something to that effect. And the last 2, and the biggest ones, are some sort of violence, I guess. The first one, and the last one we're going to talk about today, the next one is going to be a little later in the Gold and Silver arc, is here we have Sabrina's Alakazam that stops Green in her tracks, revealing these 2 Pokeballs. And generally speaking, I'm not one that cries censorship over relatively minor changes. In fact, I'd go even farther and say 4Kids or most 90s kids anime's greatest crime wasn't necessarily mangling whatever series that they're adapting for a child audience that it wasn't initially meant for, but messing with the anime soundtrack to remove the implications or emotional weight or peril that is going on. That said, I'm guessing this change here, and I'm basically with Viz on this one, is I don't even want to humor the idea of the cast of Pokemon as anything but Barbie and Ken dolls. That aside, this resulted in one of my favorite edits to any property ever. This changes Green from getting a read on Sabrina, who's a psychic, to Green saying, "Gotcha," and Sabrina saying, and I quote, "I lost my focus when she dissed me." I think that is the greatest line in basically any Pokemon media. It's such a powerful move. Green is such a Chad that she made Sabrina, the psychic, entirely lose focus just by being dissed, just by playing that type of mind game. I guess that muddies the character moment here where the thief character was able to read minds better than the actual psychic, and that's still sort of here, in that Green was able to predict what Sabrina was going to do and planned ahead because she knew she wouldn't be able to get to her Pokeballs normally. Green played a mind game with Sabrina to make her think that she had an out when she actually didn't, taking Sabrina off guard just long enough to create an out for herself. Okay, this video is getting to be almost an hour long, I think, so in for a penny, in for a pound. Let's touch on that child abuse for just 1 second. So the last major change in the manga is a little bit later in Gold and Silver, where there's an instance of parental child abuse, I believe. I won't get too much into it today, but I do think it is interesting while we're bringing up censorship in the series to just go ahead and do it now while the video is super duper long, and probably, I hope, the most extensive look at Pokemon Adventure, or at least the first 40 chapters or so on the internet. And some people feel like that's a little bit of hypocrisy, mostly because we see the kids so far get hurt a lot. They get roughed up by adults pretty often. Just a few chapters ago, Blue was almost beaten to death and had his entrails ripped out. Red's almost been eaten by Pokemon, burned alive, frozen, crushed, drowned, and electrocuted multiple times. But I guess there's a stark difference here between supervillains and general bad guys and other over-there dudes that we're going to beat up later and toss them in jail and throw away the key or whatever have you, beating up on the good guys, than it coming from an at-home parental figure. That sort of thing may end up ringing a little bit too true if you happen to be a child with some experience with being abused. While I am definitely in the camp of it's fine to have that type of thing in manga because it will teach kids a little bit more about the world, specifically being able to recognize what type of position that they themselves are put into, because kids don't really have that type of wisdom built in. It's something you learn usually much, much later down the line. However, I can also sympathize with Viz here. With the whole Green thing, I can sympathize with them saying, listen, this is a Nintendo property, Nintendo makes kids stuff, and I honestly don't want to make this a controversy, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this because this is a little bit of a cash cow. But a bigger factor here And I think it's the one that leads a lot of these sort of decisions, is that Pokemon inherently isn't really competing with other anime more often than not. The competition for Pokemon Adventure isn't going to be the normal comic book store floppies of manga that you normally see, like City Hunter or Ranma One Half. And it's also usually not going to be other VHSs of other things you'd find at Blockbuster, like Slayers or Patlabor or anything like that. But it's going to be other things that are geared specifically towards children that are airing on Cartoon Network, for example, things like Metabots or Digimon, etc., or even the Walt Disney Company. So I can definitely forgive if Viz Media said, this isn't the place that we're going to try to stick our necks out on. In fact, I think it would take another 5 or 6 years for unflipped manga to be commonplace, let alone for entirely accurate translations. That kind of battle wouldn't be won for almost another decade. This actually reminds me of an old Anime News Network article that outlined the history of manga in the States. And they got to Shonen Jump and they were afraid of stuff like Becky from Midwest Colorado or something calling in about why her son had a comic book where a guy gets his head knocked off or something like that. The manga in question was Naruto, and I know Naruto's cool, we all know Naruto's cool, it's basically harmless and little kids content, but Mom isn't as cool. Sure, there was anime on TV that is also accessible, like look at Gohan. He's gonna have some nerve damage after whatever this is, and that was at like 4 p.m. But places where you'd find anime would be Sci-Fi, which is an adult channel airing this pretty late at night, and Toonami, that's backed by Turner Broadcasting and can afford to place their feet in the ground and just say, this is how it's going to be. Viz Media, on the other hand, doesn't have that luxury because at the time I believe they were a newer company. So anyway, my point being is that I can basically understand Viz saying, yeah, okay, let's play this a little bit safe because Pokemon is not normal comics. And keep in mind, next door at Anime Land, Pokemon literally jetted 4 kids from being an obscure nobody company to being damn near made of money and the go-to guys you talk to when you need a large-scale Americanized adaptation of a media property from Japan. Okay, that's enough about child abuse and the adaptation of large multimedia properties for one day. Let's see what Red & Company are doing. Oh. Okay, well, let's actually back up a second. So the badges in the games are a mechanic to make sure you can't just trade a max level Pokemon over to a fresh game file and just stomp the entire game with it. Generally the mechanic doesn't really come up much, but in the first game it has this quote, "The Earth badge makes Pokemon of any level obey. It is evidence of your mastery as a trainer." And after getting the Rising badge in Gen 2, it says this. All Pokemon will recognize you as a trainer and obey your every command without question. Again, in the game, this doesn't do much because your Pokemon aren't going to be at level 90 at that point, but in any other medium, doesn't that sound like a really powerful thing, or at least very ominous, that's ripe for being abused? In the game, the implication is that you're a good enough Pokemon expert to where you know how to handle something like a big dragon or a giant turtle or something like that. But when you add words like obey and without question, it sounds like something where there's evil afoot, or at least the potential thereof. Kind of like when you and your dad are kicking back, making a big robot in the robot repair yard like anime mechanic guys do, and it just so happens to be called Devil Gundam. While not necessarily evil, it sounds like the kind of thing where if you happen to not be evil and working on it, you're going to find yourself dead in a ditch or with a knife squarely planted in your back or something to that effect because you've seen too much and just aren't evil enough to go with it. Anyway, I bring all this up because it's come up a few times that it's actually kind of difficult to transport Pokemon that you personally don't own, because it seems that Pokemon that you don't own can't go in their ball. That's why you can't just put Pokemon that you steal in their ball and then smuggle them out in a car. They just won't go in. And Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno are especially dangerous and powerful Pokemon. So, Team Rocket also needs all of the gym badges, which is probably why they immediately started enlisting gym leaders to help them out. And this is also how they kept the 3 birds under control as well. Whereas their normal tactics are either to use Pokemon they already own, or just sick Pokemon that are already angry and riled up and afraid on anyone that doesn't like them, like Lieutenant Surge's Electabuzz that was previously chained up and just sort of sicked on Red, not really following Lieutenant Surge's commands, but just a feral animal that will attack anything that it sees. Oh, hey there, fellas, it's me from the future. Anyway, just chiming in to let everybody know, Lieutenant Surge's Electabuzz actually did listen to his commands, so maybe me saying it was exclusively feral was not entirely accurate at that moment, and I thought that because something similar happens a little bit later in the manga. However, that Electabuzz was in chains, so I think it stands to reason that it wasn't just because the thing was feral, but because it was feral and also afraid of Lieutenant Surge and his goons. Pokemon established early on that physically harming Pokemon is off limits, but the implication, or at least for Generation 1, was still there. And it wouldn't surprise me very much if that was basically the case here, where Lieutenant Surge's Electabuzz attacked Red because Lieutenant Surge said so, and Lieutenant Surge is someone that is not against hurting Pokemon, and Electabuzz knew that. Okay, now back to Past Me, who isn't friends with Hop yet. The trio rescue Professor Oak. Team Rocket has an amplifier that's the secret not only to probably controlling the birds, but making a new Pokemon that seems to also line up with Green's ulterior motives. She tries to use the amplifier with the badges, including the ones that she stole from Red, but instead of doing whatever she was trying to do with it, it releases a pulse that fuses together Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno into this thing. We'll come back to this later. Sabrina reveals that it was the plan all along to have Red journey all around Kanto to collect all of the gym badges from the gym leaders not on Team Rocket's payroll, and take them when the time was right. Also, Erica, Brock, and Misty are here trying to catch Team Rocket's goons as they escape the building. Team Rocket's plan doesn't entirely make sense to me here. I'm not the guy to nitpick a series and point out every minor plot hole and just call myself an asshole for doing that. I'm more of an asshole for evading my taxes and locking people in my basement and forcing them to read comic books. But Team Rocket claims to have been watching Red since day one. By the time Team Rocket would have noticed Red at the earliest would have been Mount Moon, and at that point he would have already had the Boulder badge, and at the very least access to the Cascade badge because he's already with Misty. So that's 2 of the 3 badges that Team Rocket claims to have set Red up to been collecting the entire time. Again, that's a relatively minor nitpick because I don't like to nitpick a series to death if it provides, on average, a pretty fun experience, but it was something I felt was a little bit of a glaring flaw when they were trying to set up a whole aha, we were on to you the entire time, you've been set up from day one. It just doesn't quite make sense. I guess it's possible that Team Rocket may have been keeping tabs on Blue, who constantly got into conflict with Red, leading Team Rocket to just keep tabs on any promising trainers to join their ranks later on, and Red just happened to be one of those. But again, even though I have read things into this series that probably weren't there to begin with, but I feel like that particular stretch is maybe doing it a little too far because I feel like stretching logic should mostly be in the interest not of making something's internal logic work, but in service of making the media more relatable to the audience. Although, given what we've seen so far and what happens in the Pokemon Yellow arc, it is a little bit odd that they would drop the ball with this logical inconsistency. Again, not upset that they would go as far as to make a tiny continuity error like that, especially because the series is being made week to week, but it just seems a little bit out of character with the writing of the series being so focused on making Pokemon a living, breathing narrative, where something like this would have been at least hinted at from the start or had a clever retcon. Anyway, the amalgamation Pokemon knocks the trio out of the building, but they're caught on a freshly evolved Venusaur's vines and they retaliate with Vine Whip, Hydro Pump, and Fire Blast, defeating Sabrina and separating the 3 birds. They evacuate the building and go their separate ways, but not before Red catches a glimpse of Giovanni, who's been lurking nearby. Before we leave this arc, the idea of a Pokemon fusion is a cool idea. I honestly used to hate this stupid bird thing. It looks kind of lazy and a byproduct of Nintendo saying, yeah, no new Pokemon without our approval. And I get that, but these guys are just sort of next to each other. Now, in its defense, and I'll go into this way more later, there's this ongoing theme and conflict in Generation 1 of Pokemon about nature and technology constantly coming into conflict with each other, and knowing that nature is generally the good guy, but erasing technology is simply not an option. And the three birds fusing is more reminiscent of birds caught in, like, soda can nettings, and is an easy shorthand for human intervention has gone too far, and is visibly and immediately upsetting, and obviously a shorthand for messing with the natural order. So I guess keep that kind of thing in mind if you're like me, and think this thing is a huge letdown after being hyped up. Anyway, Blue says he's looking forward to challenging Red later at the Indigo Plateau, and the three go their separate ways. Later on, they establish that at some point Mewtwo has escaped from Team Rocket and took off towards Cerulean City. Red's just been sort of wandering the countryside, slowly meandering back towards Indigo Plateau, and heard about a mysterious Cerulean City beast, and despite Bill's warning, says, "Hell, let's check that boy out." But his Pokemon aren't feeling it, and immediately are caught off guard by a tornado that whips them all around, blowing away Red's Pokeballs. But then Blaine runs in to help. Blaine is here to defeat this monster, Cerulean. Mewtwo is, as we've established before, a clone of Mew that didn't have enough cells, so as a proxy, Blaine used some of his own cells, mutating his arm into this sort of Kronbergian monster. And Blaine knows that eventually, if this isn't resolved, the Mewtwo cells in him will end up taking over his body and killing him. And the cells also serve as, again, a very Kronbergian Mewtwo detector, turning into a very fleshy paste that points towards the direction of Mewtwo. And Mewtwo is too dangerous to just be allowed to run wild. And if Blaine is in pain, he knows that Mewtwo also is in pain, so he feels it's his responsibility alone to try to fight and capture Mewtwo, because it must also be in pain. He knows that trying to catch Mewtwo is just way too dangerous, and it's better to handle this with a Master Ball. The catch is, however, is that you have to get close enough to Mewtwo to do this, and Mewtwo is a beast that's just genetically bred for combat. Red, Blaine, Arrow, and Pika use some very clever tactics to get the jump on Mewtwo and hit it with a Master Ball, earning Blaine's praise for helping him help Mewtwo. Later, Red heads out to Viridian Forest where he encounters a girl who's being attacked by a Dratini that totally won't be important later, along with a horde of Golem, Weezing, and other Pokemon that just shouldn't be in Viridian Forest. Red quickly gets all these guys out of the way and advises the girl, you should always be nice to Pokemon, and Pokemon will always be your friend back, and he even helps her catch a Rattata. Afterwards, he heads into the city where he's told about the Viridian City gym leader and how they've gone missing. Red checks out the gym just to see if anyone was there, and sees a bust of what would turn out to be Giovanni, who is actually here and reveals himself not only to be the gym leader, but the leader of Team Rocket, and the first time they met was only a test. Giovanni has a cool fight with Red where he challenges Red to drop all his Pokeballs on the ground, and they will fight that way. Specifically, they have a match where what Pokeball you grab and exactly how you grab it end up making a difference, as well as a trainer's physical attributes also being important, with the implication being that the battle isn't over when all the Pokemon are knocked out, but whoever concedes first is the loser. Red's Poliwrath attacked first when Giovanni didn't have a Pokemon out. I don't think that it's grim or dark, but it is interesting that games are games, and the anime says it's outright illegal to attack a trainer because these are one-on-one Pokemon affairs, but again, the manga doesn't have this type of distinction to it, and this actually comes up a lot in the next arc and is an important crux of this battle. Giovanni generally likes Red and his attitude, and even if he is evil, he does recognize the value and power in being kind to Pokemon, and decides to raise the stakes. If Red wins, he can just leave and claim the Boulder Badge. However, if he loses, he joins Team Rocket, with the Pokeballs on the floor being a sort of representation of equal footing. However, Giovanni uses his Pokemon to alter the battlefield, where Red wouldn't be able to easily reach his Pokeballs, like his Golem ricocheting around the room, and even going as far as to send his Beedrill to corner Red and basically tell him surrender or die. But Red has learned to fight smart through all this conflict with Team Rocket, Red was standing on his own Pokeball the entire time, just in case this specific scenario comes up where he's cornered without any Pokeballs. It's very interesting that they actually don't bother showing Red's feet for this, so there is a layer of deniability where other series may end up tripping on their own feet a little bit and trying to make up a way the hero used clever tricks to get themselves out, but here this was at least thought of in the chapter beforehand. The gym basically gets destroyed and Red's Pokeballs are all knocked away, so Giovanni figures he has Red pinned with no Pokemon and takes a moment to announce his evil plans. Specifically, experimenting on Pokemon in Celadon City, sending them back to Saffron for training, where they then will be shipped out on the SSN to Cinnabar Island, and then left in Viridian Forest to basically revert back to being wild, hence why there were so many wild Pokemon that were super strong that just weren't native to Viridian Forest in the last chapter. This would basically let Giovanni build a super strong Pokemon army in his supposed absence. No one knows about this but Red and Giovanni, and Red determines that he has to find a way to beat Giovanni here and now because no one else can. Right then, Pika's Pokeball rolled towards Red, but Giovanni doesn't care, leading to one of my favorite moments. Giovanni is really not concerned with Pika being here because he could launch an attack immediately. He has his Pokemon right here. But it would take Red a moment to throw the Pokeball and another moment for Pika to get out, get its bearings, and then ready a Thunderbolt. And at that point, Red would just be long dead. And I hate it where anime guys calculate the exact amount of time and the exact units of strength it would take to do stuff. Like in JoJo or Dragon Ball Z, where they say something will happen in 10 seconds, and then 27 seconds pass, and they act like they have a hard 3 seconds left when that's really not how that kind of thing works. Or anime guys that talk about exactly what percent of their power level they're using. The only instance I can think of where I did like this was in the dub of Yu Yu Hakusho, where Toguro says he's going from 100% to his true 100%, which is pretty lame. But in the dub, they changed that to 100%, and the true 100%, just adding in a superfluous line about he actually lied. The first 100% was more like 85, which is clever, and I like that. Anyway, Red shocks Giovanni out of nowhere with Pika. It's, as it turns out, he had used Lieutenant Surge's insulated gloves to have Pika ready a Thunderbolt while still inside of its Pokeball. Giovanni comments that his loss was at the hands of technology that he himself developed, but Red says it was actually orchestrated by him, causing all this pain to Pokemon, with both of them passing out. Red wakes up with the girl that he met earlier, and people are trying to calm all the raging Pokemon in the forest, and he's offered a position as the gym leader, and it would be nice to have a very compassionate and strong trainer around to do all the cool stuff that Red does, because as far as the people are concerned, they just haven't had a gym leader in a long time, and I suppose having a gym leader comes with a whole lot of social responsibilities, like taking care of this whole super strong wild Pokemon hanging out in Viridian Forest. Red says sure, why not, but before doing any of that, runs off saying, hey, I'll be back later to be the best gym leader of all time, which I don't think he does. Okay, we're closing in on the finale. It's time for the Pokemon Championship Tournament with Red, Blue, Green, and a mysterious Dr. O, whoever that could be. I'm happy they skip all the filler with Red walking over to Indigo Plateau and all the matches that probably happened before this and the whole explanation of how the league works. They just hop right in and skip right to all that cool anime stuff. Because to have it be a having this as a multi-day or week-long cultural festival may be cool, but it doesn't really work in a weekly shonen series where every week it's been about a week or so since we've last checked in. Green fights the mysterious Dr. O, who is soundly publicly made a fool of by Justice Spiro. Dr. O had taken advantage of Green's debilitating fear of birds and explained that at some point Green as a child was abducted by a giant bird Pokemon, and it turns out it's Professor Oak, who knows all about Green and how she was the one that stole the Squirtle because she has cameras, and talked a little bit more about her backstory. Green was also from Pallet Town and left many years earlier, and came back when she heard that two boys went on a Pokemon journey. That made her very upset because she always also wanted to go on a journey, but just never had the opportunity to, and said, "Forget it, I'm stealing a Squirtle." After this, again, Dr. O reveals himself to be Professor Oak. Note how bad this alias is, because in the Japanese version of Pokemon, professors generally go by doctors. But the professor doesn't really care to win the tournament, for the record. He drops out because he's already won his championship some number of years earlier. And I believe this is one of the only times it's really touched down on that at some point Professor Oak was a Pokemon champion, because this is very clearly stated in most versions of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, etc., but it's never touched down upon at any point after that. So that basically means the semi-final match with Red and Green is actually getting bumped up to be the final match. The battle itself isn't really super interesting, or at least I don't think so, and that's because the emotional stakes are basically gone. Red shows that he has a lot more technical mastery that he's gained throughout his whole adventure, and Blue shows that he knows when to call it quits and when to call back his Pokemon and say, "You did a good job, you've done the best you can do, there's no reason to exert yourself anymore." Also, this is the tournament setting, but I'm not 100% of what the rules are, because Red sends out Polly, Pika, and Sar to take down Charizard, which seems kind of odd because this is a 3-on-1 situation, and I'm not sure why they wouldn't do that from the start, but I guess that's fine. Also, Red uses 4 Pokemon and Blue uses 3, and Red is deemed the winner. It would make sense for Blue to concede, with his personality being a little less rough than he used to be, and just being an empathetic person and just being able to accept that this is a losing battle and there's no point in making his Pokemon work harder than they have to be for an already losing battle. In any case, Red is again crowned the victor, and Mew watches all this and flies off into the sunset, thus ending Pokemon Adventure, the Red, Blue, and Green chapter. That seemed a little anticlimactic, but most Pokemon games end up suffering from this too. Specifically the issue of, okay, the main conflict is resolved, but there's still some more of this stuff dealing with who's the biggest and baddest and coolest to hammer out. I guess pride being on the line should be a good enough motivation, but Pokemon as a series with a narrative kind of drives home that it's not your Pokemon that make you cool or how big your power levels are, but what fun adventures you've had along the way. And typically by the end, you've pretty much had all of your adventures. For example, we generally accept that after 20 seasons of Pokemon as a show, Ash is generally a good trainer, despite never winning any large tournaments, except for once or twice, I think. And the reason for that is that Pokemon as a media property is very big on the journey, and not so much the destination. So, whenever you get around to hitting the destination, it's always just a little bit of a letdown. I've only read the first 3 arcs as of recording all this, but I'm happy that Hidenori Kusaka has figured out nice and early that a good adaptation of Pokemon can't keep doing this, because it took Game Freak about 15 years to figure out that they can't just keep rehashing the same plot over and over, and even then they seem to be at best extremely reluctant to do anything about that. I guess in the manga's case here, I can accept that a little bit more because this isn't really so much of a resolution to the plot, but closer to an epilogue, where Red, Blue, and Green have already done the bulk of their development for the arc, and we've seen that in the last arc. And here we're just chilling out while the stakes are nice and low and showing all the things that they've learned. More so Red and Blue than Green. Okay, now that we have the plot out of the way, let's get around to talking about those characters. Today we're mostly going to stick to the main trio because the rest of the B-cast have much larger roles in Pokemon Yellow that we will talk about some other day, and it wouldn't really be right because a lot of these characters didn't get enough screen time, and I wouldn't feel right talking about them without that additional context. First up is our boy Red. Red is a normal shonen guy. He's hot-headed, dumb, gets into trouble, and loves helping his friends. Like many, but definitely not all anime guy archetypes, Red also brings a certain level of competency to the table as well. So his antics aren't quite as frustrating as they could be, mostly because he's very comfortable around Pokemon, And while maybe not being an expert from the word go, he is certainly knowledgeable enough to get around, and skilled enough at Pokemon where even from the word go, nothing ever really felt like a one-sided match for Red. A lot of game anime really aren't sure where to draw the line at how competent the protagonist is at a game. Like, Yugi in theory is good at games, and his grandpa already owns a game store. He's already played all the games so much that he just memorizes the rules. He's the guy that just has a board game at all times and just an entire D&D set. He always comes off as a little bit incompetent because he's always radically getting in over his head and needs the Spirit of the Pharaoh to come to his rescue, because without that, he's entirely helpless despite all the prowess he's shown in that area before. Red is kind of like what Yugi probably should have been in practice but didn't have the weight of needing a second half. A guy that plays Pokemon a lot and can beat it with his eyes closed, but also needs to learn how to fight smarter and not harder. And more often than not, he does show the ability to do that, like having Pika get a Thunderbolt ready while inside of a Pokeball. This almost gives me a lot of Joseph Joestar vibes of making your opponent think you're a dumb idiot, but Red's two quirks as a character are the things that are at the core of Pokemon. He likes to fight, and he's uniquely nice to Pokemon. And I guess in a Pokemon narrative where things battle a lot and has a very overt environmental theme, it isn't too wild to say that that would be a good fit. But then again, given that we've seen people being a jerk to Pokemon for profit, and we've also seen characters like Blue and Green that from the outside would look kind of like jerks and slave drivers or have a blatant disregard for their Pokemon. Blue always being way too militant and Green stealing the Squirtle. While Green ultimately is a good person and a good trainer, that would be like stealing someone's cat. It might work out in the long run, but in the short term, you're separating that cat from its entire way of life and previous owner that probably also had love and affection for it. Red's traits are the exact type of traits that I generally take for granted. I think that someone who's basically Steve Irwin but younger and for Pokemon is a good take on a Pokemon protagonist. This, in combination with Red just being someone that enjoys fighting, seems pretty bland, and I'm honestly not sure how to expand on it from there. Red just likes to fight, except for adding the additional context of most Pokemon media is pretty happy having a cookie-cutter shonen character that likes to fight. This isn't always the case for Adventure. Most protagonists have their own quirks, and Red is even specifically the guy that likes to fight and is able to connect emotionally to proud Wamu-type warrior guys, and later he even gets the title The Fighter. Red isn't really interesting on his own, but the context of knowing what's coming up makes him a lot more interesting than he would usually be. Especially knowing that he's going to be the exception to the rule and knowing how to catch and raise Pokemon before his adventure even starts, making him a lot more fun in hindsight. Speaking of hindsight, Poliwhirl is Red's main Pokemon, but later that kind of switches to Pikachu, and I'm guessing this is probably a marketing thing, because in early Pokemon material, you saw a lot of Poliwhirl and Clefairy, and I'm guessing Game Freak expected those two to be way more popular, but that just ended up being Pikachu, who may not be Red's main Pokemon, certainly does begin carrying a lot of extra weight and is usually there for all of Red's major battles and takes part in. The rest of Red's Pokemon are a little bit one note, but I do enjoy that all of Red's Pokemon are things that you would realistically have if you played the first generation of Pokemon. Next up is Blue. Blue is also known as Green in the Japanese version, because the duo of Pokemon Red and Blue in Japan were Pokemon Red and Green, with Blue being a supplementary version later down the road. But for the American release, the games are Pokemon Red and Blue, so the natural place to go to for naming a rival would be Blue, and the natural place for a supplementary character who didn't necessarily appear in the original work would be Green. It's a little hard to talk about Blue because his arc and a lot of the arcs of the supporting characters don't really wrap up until the Gold and Silver or Yellow arcs, but sure. Blue is naturally an inverse of Red. He's more goal-oriented. Red likes to fight, but Blue likes to train. Much like where Red would get the title The Fighter, Blue would get the title of The Trainer. And that's odd because all Pokemon guys are trainers, but I'm guessing it's written in Japanese in a way where it wouldn't be as redundant of a title to have. In terms of broader anime archetypes, Red would be more akin to Luffy or Joseph Joestar, And he's mostly doing things by the seat of his pants, or the secret technique that he's been talking about is actually one he just thought of like 10 minutes ago. And maybe there might have been an implication that this was a thing his brain was working on, but he never really had the idea to execute it until just now, like the insulated gloves, or keeping the Pokeball under his foot just in case of an ambush later on. Blue is a little bit closer to, surprisingly, a Dragon Ball Z character, like Goku, where his solution to most things isn't think of a crazy solution that you just thought of just now, but hitting the gym. All of his Pokemon have training drills and don't understand the concept of a smoke break. Not to say that Blue doesn't care or is willing to work his Pokemon to death or anything like that, but it just isn't an axis that he works on. Or at least not until meeting Red, and even then he still had to work on it. Red wouldn't go as far as to inflict an almost fatal wound to a Pokemon, just in case things got out of hand, but Blue would. He wouldn't really bother to have a heart-to-heart talk with the Pokemon that Red would, especially if it's one that's just not listening. He does eventually learn when to call it quits on this kind of thing, and when to think with his heart instead of his head. He's also very serious as well. In the game, Blue is mostly concerned with testing Red at every possible step of the way, and possibly he might just be here for his grandfather's attention, but here, he's showing a little bit more generic anime rival guy traits, and gets dead serious when the situation escalates, enough to where he can't afford to keep the cool, aloof anime guy thing up. His Pokemon are also one note, probably even more so than Red's, but I like that his team composition has this very strong, sharp, masculine makeup to him. That also gives them a certain era of coolness. That's something that Mato and the other artist that works on the series later is very good at doing. Making very small changes to Pokemon design so they match the general attitudes of the trainer. For example, I never thought for a day in my life that Porygon or Golduck would be two Pokemon I would ever consider to be cool. I've mostly said everything I already wanted to say about Green, but for the sake of symmetry, let's go over it again. For the time being, there's a lot more of Green's story arc that comes later on down the line, but for the time being, she's like a safe-for-work Fujiko Mine from Lupin III. She typically has her own agenda, and it seems to relate to her being abducted by a giant bird Pokemon in her youth. Most of her Pokemon aren't just for fighting. Like, she can fight, but all of her Pokemon fit into a larger plan. Her Ditto was used for trickery. She traded Red's Moonstone for his Badges back, mostly because she wanted the Moonstone and it was part of her plan to have an evolved Clefable. She uses Blastoise for quick getaways, Horsey for ink diversions, and Jigglypuff for flying around. I think having a character like this makes the series flow a little bit better. Once again, too often shonen series come down to a hot-blooded man and his hot-blooded rival, and they have a big fight. While Green isn't around as much as Red and Blue, her presence is always a fun diversion from that particular type of shonen action. She shows a different type of Pokemon, besides just battling while still being very much proactive. Eventually, it did come down to Red and Blue just sort of duking it out as anime guys do, but again, for the main conflict, Green was just as important to stopping Team Rocket as Red and Green were, although some parts of it were her fault. But again, it is very fun that she manipulates people into doing what she wants them to do, and has a tiny bit of that femme fatale element, using her quote-unquote womanly ways to trick you, but not really having the overt disrespect women juice, for lack of better words. It's used in a way that feels cool instead of a way that feels like you need a good dose of respect women juice. This probably has the most attention drawn to it here because she's the only major female good guy that really does a whole lot, but in later parts from her second and third appearance where it gets a little evened out because it just seems like she's just another character in the cog, and she basically does this regardless of gender. Much like Red could come off as boring because he's just a fighting guy, that is alleviated quite a bit because there are other characters that don't fight. Green comes off a whole lot better knowing that there are a whole plethora of other women characters coming later on down the line that don't just pull the femme fatale thing. And again, I really do enjoy her going toe-to-toe with dangerous folks like Sabrina and the antagonist for the next arc, outwitting the psychic and all that good stuff. To my understanding, Green was intended to be part of Generation 1 of Pokemon as an actual girl counterpart to Red, but cut pretty far into where concept art of her still existed. So I guess she was tossed in the manga to sort of fill a role that just wouldn't otherwise have a appropriate Pokemon character to fill in. Mostly because Generation 1 of Pokemon is pretty light on characters, which I guess results in how we get to the Pokemon Yellow arc, where it's mostly centered around the supporting cast because there just aren't very many characters in Pokemon. Or at least for the time being there aren't. But that's enough about Green because I basically said everything I wanted to say about her earlier, and there is more cool stuff to say because we will not be hearing the last about Green. Actually, that basically rounds out the most super critical cast members. Normally it'd be a good time to talk about the gym leaders and all the secondary cast, but most of them are about at their halfway points of their character arcs, and even Red and Green have a lot more to talk about in the Pokemon Yellow arc, which again, I can't stress enough, is probably the most interesting use I've seen for secondary characters since like maybe the Frieza arc of Dragon Ball Z or the bulk of Hunter x Hunter, but we'll talk about that some other time. Okay, so take off those weighted clothes and take off your shackles because I couldn't leave without talking about the heart and themes of the first arc of Pokemon Adventure. Okay, we're an hour and a half into the video, so I think it's probably safe for me to really bust out the hot takes. Only the real troopers are still here, I think. So the Red, Blue, and Green chapter does a great job of backing up the themes of the game, and those themes are usually not very clear as they are here, or at the very least, maybe aren't as visible because Pokemon as a property generally overrides its own thematic weight with the fact that it is Pokemon. Most notably, the idea of technology and nature. Gen 1 of Pokemon, nature and technology are constantly butting heads, and constantly introducing the idea that both of these things are constantly benefiting you, but also clashing with each other. The games usually don't really bother telling you which one is right or wrong, or we aren't going to talk about nature going too far in the games because it basically rarely touches on that. And Adventure more so does in the next arc, but we'll talk for the time now about just the technology end of things. Pokemon very rarely bothers to paint technology as being outright wrong. There's nothing wrong with a hamburger or houses or computers. Hell, technology has been a huge asset and why it's so easy for people in Pokemon to live side by side with each other. Look at things like the Safari Zone, which is a sanctuary for Pokemon, or the Pokeball that allows you to just deal with Pokemon in a very harmless way, or store ones that are your friends in a safe holding spot. The issue is when people take this way too far and step out of line and betray a sort of natural order, when things are going too far, and that's usually, more often than not, when you start causing pain. Creating Pokemon is hypothetically fine, so is reviving ones or just making them up from scratch like Porygon. Human intervention apparently even leads to other Pokemon cropping up, like Porygon, Electrode, Grimer, and Weezing, and if you really want to stretch it, and I will, but most people probably won't, Dugtrio, Machamp, and Tauros having extra limbs, or Snorlax moving out of its natural mountain home to start wreaking havoc on the lower end of things. Because all these Pokemon on some level have been either messed with by technology or have in some way have had their environment altered. And what we're seeing is basically the consequences of that happening. This is all implied information, partially from the game, partially from the media, but when odd Pokemon were beginning to be exported into Viridian Forest, again, in theory, that's fine. There isn't anything illegal about Grimers hanging out in the forest, but in practicality, these are all hyped up wild Pokemon that have been provoked and mistreated and will attack. That's sort of how things work in the real world a little bit, where Pokemon are treated like a force of nature, and it's never really the Pokemon that's in danger, but the people. The Pokemon may be in some immediate danger, but as a cosmic threat, it's really humanity that's an issue here. Again, like nature, Pokemon will sort themselves out eventually, that's just a circle of life. Pokemon like Electrode will keep doing their thing regardless of human intervention, so will guys like Grimer and Porygon. It's people that are in danger, like Machoke attacking Red in Professor Oak's lab, or Magmar attacking Pewter City, that's geographically close to Viridian Forest, so we can safely assume that those Pokemon attacking are a direct byproduct of Giovanni and Team Rocket putting those Pokemon out of their natural habitat and putting them into Viridian Forest, where they just go nuts and start making havoc. But that's on the smaller end, and on the higher end is Mewtwo just being able to make tornadoes and having something like that just wreaking havoc on the countryside. Or again, badges are fine to calm down a Pokemon. I think the implication here is that it stops guys like Ash from getting roasted by their own Pokemon. But that can also be used to make what's basically a WMD, which is also what they seem to do in the manga. This comes up a lot in Pokemon games and movies where, in theory, a huge legendary Pokemon, a minor deity, consenting to be caught, is basically fine, but making that Pokemon listen to you is literally how you get global warming. That literally happens in the game. Pokemon also plays with this balance of nature for metaphysical stuff as well. Reviving Pokemon with the intention to make it your friend and letting it go about its day as a normal Pokemon is fine. We see that with fossil Pokemon, we see that with Red's Aerodactyl. It's pretty much going about its day as a normal Pokemon would be that you would normally catch, and that's fine. And that does circumvent the whole circle of life and death thing, but I guess because your intention isn't to disrupt the natural order, that's fine. But reviving Pokemon with the sole purpose of having them fight for you, like having an undead army like we see with Koga in the Pokemon Tower, that's bad. Or at the very least, that's bad in the way the narrative frames it. I'll put a pin in that for now, because I love going on insane rants about Pokemon, especially this nature and technology one. This could all be fuel for its own video, but I'm sure we'll look at that more in other arcs and other early Pokemon adaptations when it comes up. This overarching theme comes to a head when Giovanni said himself that he was undone by his own technology, specifically the insulated glove. But Red responds by saying it was by hurting Pokemon that he was undone. And both those things are true. It's very weird and interesting how often the environmental messages in Pokemon are tossed around, but always have the quiet caveat of technology isn't inherently bad. Yet that's never really permeated the broader perception of Pokemon, but in the manga it's spelled out in pretty clear terms. Technology is good, but don't go too far. Pokemon are good, and will generally sort themselves out, so it's really not a force of nature you want to mess with too much. This message is so ingrained into Pokemon from the very get-go that even though some of the nuances here that I'm making are a little bit of a stretch, this message is so ingrained into Pokemon from the word go, it's made very clear that anyone that will willingly be outright mean to a Pokemon has to be a monster and has to be a threat and has to be taken seriously. And again, this is sort of like the real world where a guy that may be kind of irresponsible to a dog might not be the worst piece of garbage ever, but someone that would do that on purpose, just outright cause a dog pain because they want to, like Michael Vick or Team Rocket or Giovanni, are generally seen as outright sociopaths, regardless of if it's a nothing personal kid, just business. But we will touch down on this and other complicated questions of nature, capitalism, and questions like, if you're so moral, why are you drinking Coca-Cola and banking with JP Morgan some other day? This will probably be a good part where I talk in more direct terms about the world building instead of sort of nebulous terms like I am right now, but I feel like Mother Spacement did a much better video about that than I ever really could. But most of that covers the first two arcs of the series, which has artwork by Mato, who is honestly one of the best artists in the Pokemon stable. A lot of his works offer this one-to-one adaptation to what Pokemon stuff should look like. For example, this is not the abstraction of a house, that's just what a Pokemon house looks like, or something like that. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Pokemon Adventure is really hard to break down on its own because Pokemon is a multimedia franchise, and concepts from one part of it does eventually seep its way into another version of it. Or at the very least, part of it may have at least some mild implication on the rest of the franchise. But on the whole, Adventure is probably one of the best kids' media adaptations I've read. Now, it certainly isn't the best manga of all time, or the best shonen for that matter. I'd say on a good day it hovers above average, but the weight of all the Pokemon carrying it forward, I'm really not a moe deep anime lore guy that reads stuff like Fates or Love Live or other multimedia properties, but I wonder if any of those have those same type of vibes of this piece of work works fine on its own, but because it's a companion piece to a larger property, it skyrockets into being something that's truly special. Just about everything from the games is here and accounted for, while also not being afraid to just tell its own story and do its own thing. It feels good about giving all these characters personality, and more importantly, a greater context. Like, of course, Bill, the PC guy from Pokemon, would know all about Mewtwo. He literally lives right around the corner from the postgame dungeon. Red and Blue have fleshed out backstories all their own. Badges actually have some amount of significance. And I'm not sure if this is another idea that was taken from the manga, but in the most recent game, Sword and Shield, they actually get around to making the badges an object that makes it easier to connect with Pokemon. The same for gym matches being closer to a sports event. Everything here seems to have some amount of greater mystery to it. While sometimes in Pokemon a random thing just sort of happens in the game, and a random guy just sort of does something, in the manga this ends up weaving itself into the main plot in some way, and I think that sort of thing is peak fan service. Each Pokemon is treated less like an IP, with a number and stats associated, but the biology of each Pokemon is also taken in for account. Again, like I said earlier, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar are the only 3 ghosts in the game, but each one have their own specific physical properties, like Ghastly being a ball of gas that hypnotizes you but has no real way to directly attack, Haunter being more of a normal ghost, and Gengar being a gremlin with arms and legs that can do things that Ghastly and Haunter can't. Or just giving Pokemon powers that they were basically implied to have but never really had in the game. Like Nidoking is a poison type and has deadly toxins, or Grimer can be the kind of thing that can take on a more Shoggoth-like quality and choke its prey. Some Pokemon even have their own complicated social orders and rituals that we see kind of like humans, mostly Red, of course, get tangled up in despite their best efforts. But like I said earlier, it's hard to look at Pokemon on its own merits, but as an adaptation. But next time we visit Red and his friends, we are going to take things wildly off the rails in what I feel comfortable calling one of the most ambitious filler arcs I've ever read in the Pokemon Yellow arc. Oh hey there, you made it to the end of the video. Oh, well see, that was only like an hour and a half. That's just long enough for that screaming in my basement to stop, so I better go check on that soon. So, if you dug this video, please give it a thumbs up. This was in the making for a long time, and it shows me you want to see more because there will be more coming, because the next one is already written. Ugh. Also, maybe show this video to other people, which I understand can be, like, kind of embarrassing to go, hey man, check out this hour and a half long video about Pokemon. But honestly, this video is a result of not enough people making long-form analysis content specifically for manga that isn't Dragon Ball or Berserk. Not that I have an issue for Dragon Ball and Berserk, but I mean, come on man, who's going to talk about Biomega? So if you want to see more of that, subscribe, and ring that bell, because again, the script is already done, so I'm going to be real mad if like 2 people watch this. I hate saying ring that stupid bell, but as it turns out, it actually kind of works. Personal experience. YouTube will just straight up hide a whole ass video from you if you don't. So do that. And follow me on Twitter so you can just keep ignoring all the blood on your floor. And I'll keep making more bits. Okay, get out of here. Bye. I hear the cops coming.